Now that we have concluded our overview of the axial skeleton, we can turn our attention to the appendicular division. The appendicular division contains 126 bones located in 4 regions: the pectoral girdle, the upper limbs, the pelvic girdle, and then finally the lower limbs. The girdles function to unite the limbs to the axial skeleton, and the limbs enable us to carry out our body movements. So first we'll begin with the pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle, which is also known as the shoulder girdle, consists of a total of 4 bones, that is, 2 on the right side of the skeleton and 2 on the left side of the skeleton. The 2 clavicles are the anterior bones of the pectoral girdle. Meanwhile, the 2 scapula are the posterior bones of the pectoral girdle. The functions of the pectoral girdle are to attach the upper limbs to the axial skeleton, and they also provide attachment points for many of the muscles at the shoulder joint, and many of the muscles of the arm will also attach to the pectoral girdle as well. Posteriorly, we see that the scapula do not directly connect with the vertebral column. This is what permits the pectoral girdle to be very mobile. There is no direct bony attachment between the scapula and the vertebral column. Instead, only muscles connect the scapula to the vertebral column, and the functions of those muscles are usually to move the scapula and move the shoulders. So now let's look at the individual bones of the pectoral girdle. We'll start with the clavicles. The clavicles, which are also called the collarbones, are S-shaped bones that function as a brace between the sternum and the scapula. They have a squared, flattened end that articulates with the scapula. It's called the acromial end. Meanwhile, the sternal end is rounded, and as you have probably guessed, the sternal end articulates with the sternum. So here we see the connections between the clavicle and the scapula, as well as the clavicle and the sternum. So next we have the scapula, and the scapula, also called the shoulder blades, are triangular in shape and are located on the posterior side of the rib cage. So these make up the posterior bones of the pectoral girdle. Being triangular, they have 3 borders. They have a superior border, they have a lateral border, which is also called an axillary border because of its location near the axilla or the underarm, and the medial border, which is also called the vertebral border because of its proximity to the vertebral column. The anterior surface of the scapula, which rests against the rib cage, is relatively smooth and flat. On the other side, on the posterior surface of the scapula, we see that there are several bony projections that emerge from it. The first is the very prominent spine, which is also called the scapular spine, which runs from the medial border to the lateral edge of the scapula. The spine ends at a flattened portion that's called the acromion, and the acromion is the structure that the clavicle forms a joint with. Slightly anterior to the acromion is another bony projection that's called the coracoid process. This process is an anchoring point for one part of the large biceps muscle that's located on the anterior part of the arm. And finally, we have a structure called glenoid cavity, which forms the shoulder joint with the humerus bone.